There's one thing I've learned after years of researching the unexplained. Some things don't try to hide, they try to blend in. I was in a small town that barely appeared on the map, lying on a creaky hotel bed, listening to the struggling hum of a ceiling fan fighting for its life. The case I had come to investigate seemed simple, or so I thought. A local man named Henry Kaufman had disappeared for 3 days. Then, out of nowhere, he came back home as if nothing had happened. Same clothes, same voice, same memories. But his wife swore it wasn't him. She said there was something different about his eyes. His eyes weren't his. It was supposed to be another case of paranoid spouse syndrome. A wife imagining that her husband had changed due to stress or midlife crisis. But when I sat in front of her, I realized she wasn't just scared. She was terrified. I know how this sounds, Doctor, but that is not Henry. It looks like him, talks like him. But there's nothing inside him that is really Henry. Her gaze flickered nervously between me and the closed door behind her. For a second, I thought she was about to bolt from the room, as if merely speaking about it might make it hear her. "Why do you believe that?" I asked, trying not to sound too skeptical, though I was. She took a deep breath, as if struggling to find the right words. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "Because I saw him last night, outside the house." I frowned. "Wait, you saw Henry outside?" She nodded quickly, her hands clenching the table as if trying to steady herself. "He was standing in the backyard, staring through our bedroom window. But he was also in bed next to me." I stopped writing in my notebook, staring at the woman in front of me. I searched for a logical explanation, but everything that came to mind sounded equally absurd. "Let me get this straight," I said, setting my pen down. "You saw Henry sleeping in your bed, but also outside at the same time?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling as if she was afraid of saying it out loud. "Did you approach him? Try to speak to him?" She shook her head violently. "I didn't dare, but I called out to Henry, the one in bed, and when he turned to look at me..." She trailed off, struggling to put the next words together. "What happened?" I pushed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Her gaze dropped to the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "He smiled. And..." She slowly lifted her head, her eyes filled with pure horror. "But not with his mouth." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared at the woman in front of me, her body stiff as if she had stopped breathing altogether. "What do you mean?" "He smiled." She raised a trembling hand to her face, placed her fingers under her eyes, and gently pulled the skin downward. He smiled with his eyes. A chill crawled up my spine. I had seen many strange things in my time, things I couldn't explain, but the simplicity of that sentence made my stomach twist. "I need to see him," I said finally. She sucked in a sharp breath, as if I had just suggested something unthinkable. "No, you can't. He's not..." "Ma'am, I believe you," I interrupted calmly, snapping my notebook shut. "But I can't understand what's happening unless I see him myself." She hesitated for several long seconds. Then she let out a slow, defeated breath. "Fine, but don't look into his eyes for too long." She led me to her house after midnight. I had seen my share of eerie places before, but Henry Kaufman's house wasn't one of them. It was normal, too normal, and that made it worse, because real horror doesn't live in abandoned, crumbling ruins. It lives in the ordinary places, where it shouldn't be. She hesitated at the door, inserting the key with shaking fingers. Then she turned to me and whispered, "If he notices us watching him, don't show fear." I nodded silently, though I wasn't sure I could promise that. Then she pushed the door open. The house was silent. No creaking floorboards, no shuffling movements, not even the sound of breathing. It was as if the air itself had died. Then I saw him, Henry Kaufman, or the thing that had become Henry Kaufman. He sat in the living room, dressed in a gray bathrobe, staring at the darkened TV screen. He didn't blink. He didn't move. But as his wife glanced nervously at me, I saw it, a tiny movement, almost imperceptible. Henry wasn't looking at the TV. He was watching our reflection in the black screen. The silence in the house was unnatural. It was thick, heavy, like the air itself was watching us. I stood frozen, staring at Henry's reflection in the TV. His body was completely still, but there was something off about the way he was sitting. His posture was too rigid, too perfect. His wife barely held herself together as she whispered, "Henry, darling." No response, no blinking, no breathing. But then I saw something she hadn't noticed. His reflection was delayed. I slowly raised a hand, pretending to scratch my neck, just to test. My reflection moved instantly. But Henry's? It lagged, then unnervingly caught up, like it was remembering how to move. Then, without turning his head, without shifting his body at all, his eyes locked onto mine through the TV screen. I swear I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. I hadn't done anything to draw his attention. But he saw me. And worse, he smiled. Not with his mouth. His lips remained completely still, stretched into that eerie, mannequin-like neutrality. But his eyes smiled. My fingers loosened around my notebook. My rational mind screamed at me to find a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew this wasn't Henry Kaufman. This was something wearing Henry Kaufman like a disguise. And then, his body moved. Not like a person, but like something inside him was figuring out how to use it for the first time. "Darling," his wife whispered, her voice trembling. Henry, or whatever was pretending to be Henry, slowly turned his head toward her, but his reflection didn't move. "Henry, are you okay?" No answer, just the quiet, unsettling stretch of his eye smile. Then, his mouth began to open, slowly, too slowly. His jaw kept widening, past the natural limit, past anything human, as if the muscles and bones inside his face had no idea how a mouth was supposed to work. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, he spoke. "Which Henry? Do you mean that voice?" It didn't belong to any living person. It sounded like something trying to learn how to speak, forcing air through vocal cords it didn't quite understand. Martha let out a choked sob and stumbled back. I didn't move. I couldn't. "Which Henry? Do you mean?" He repeated the question. But this time his eyes weren't smiling anymore. They twitched, subtly, unnervingly, like something inside was trying to control them, but hadn't mastered the movement yet. I forced myself to breathe, then asked the only thing I could think of. "Where is the real Henry?" Henry's, or the thing's, face twitched. His skin seemed too loose, like a mask on the verge of slipping. Then, ever so slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the closet in the corner of the room. A closet I hadn't noticed before. "If you're looking for Henry," he whispered, his voice layered with something unnatural, "you can take him." And this time, he did smile, with his mouth. And that was worse. The closet. I looked at it, then back at Henry, or whatever he was. He was still standing there, that that grotesque, too-human smile stretching across his face. Something was deeply wrong with his posture. His limbs hung too loosely. His skin looked not quite his. So, Henry is inside? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question, then replied, "Something. That looks like Henry." The air in the room felt heavier, colder, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I glanced at Martha. She stood motionless, silent tears running down her face. She already knew the truth. "Open it," the thing said, gesturing toward the closet. Every part of my brain screamed at me, Don't do it. You don't want to see what's inside." But I did. With trembling fingers, I reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open. The smell hit me first. Damp skin, rotting flesh, something old. Then I saw it. Inside the closet, among discarded clothes, were faces, not severed heads, not bodies, just faces. Some of them looked like Henry, but they were incomplete, half-formed, warped versions like unfinished copies. I staggered backward, my stomach twisting. Behind me, Henry, the thing wearing Henry, let out a soft, quiet chuckle. I turned. He was closer now. His head tilted, his eyes gleaming with something that wasn't human. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Past Martha, who stood frozen in terror. Past the furniture, past the porch, straight to my car. I fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. Finally, I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. I sped down the road, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't care where I was going, only that I was getting away. For the first time since arriving in this cursed town, I started to breathe again. I was safe, or so I thought. Then, I heard it. "Which Victor? Do you mean?" My blood ran cold. It wasn't my own thought. It wasn't an echo in my head. It was a whisper, right behind me. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the rearview mirror, and there, in the back seat, Henry was sitting, smiling.